We greet those who are watching us from at home. We have the panel. We have Professor Ford from Catholic University, Professor Noone from Catholic University, Father Peter Damian Fellner from the La Crosse Shrine in Wisconsin, Father James McCurry, the Provincial of St. Anthony Province. Well, this is the panel, and there's a certain degree of informality, and there's a certain degree of being able to exchange with one another. I know, having sat at table tonight, we had lively discussions in many different ways, so we're going to open that up for all of you. If you have doctoral projects in mind, then you've got three wonderful minds to pick. I'll never forget Father Aidan Carr in the seminary early on when they started studying theology. He said, pick somebody that you can pick their brains. And I thought, oh, that's a pretty rough phrase. But then all my life I've thought, what pick that brains mean? He meant that very positively. Pick out the very best insights that you can get from those persons. So I'll just pause for a few moments to give the speakers, if they'd like to lead with a theme, or from the audience to raise a question, and I'll try in some very modest way to just steer it and see that it keeps going, okay?
To Professor Noone, in Pope Benedict's famous Regensberg lecture, he took a passing swipe at Blessed John Duns Scotus, and subsequently in later talks of his, he retracted a bit on what seemed to be implied in the Regensberg lecture regarding the linking of Scotus and nominalism. Would you like to make some comment on that?
Sure. Please. Sure. Yes, I mean, you've got two events. The one that was in Rome, I guess, January or so, or December, at the time of the I think the paper didn't come out to December, but December, I think it was, just the last issuance of Osservatore Romano, just before Christmas, 2008. That was the first. That was the first time because it was his letter on the. To those of us who were at the actual on the feast day there in Köln, and it was very clear from that he had already gone back from the position, or seemingly taking in the Regensburg address, and I think even more now in this, I guess it was in March or April, whenever it was, in the spring, he had some remarks on, maybe it was in June, on Scotus as part of that theological series he had. So I think those are the two places I would suggest where the Holy Fathers come back from that seemingly more extreme statement. I mean, the tradition of this, of blaming Scotus, as it were, you can trace back to a Dominican. Actually, believe it or not, this particular more virulent strain goes right back to a Dominican whose name is Abraham Zwodius. It's a Polish name. I don't pronounce it correctly, I'm sure. Who actually wrote in the 17th century and caused the Franciscans to designate Luke Wadding to do the famous Wadding edition. That's what, believe it or not, was the proximate progenitor that was. And it was already the case that people were blaming him for the thought currents, if you want, that led to the Protestant Reformation in due course. And the usual way of doing that was to suggest that Duns Scotus had too heavy an emphasis on the will and or the freedom of the will, and then that led to excessive voluntarism was the claim. And then, in what I think is even more remarkable, the claim that somehow Scotus's examination of the foundations of knowledge, which he goes through several times, of course, led to Occam's position, and that in turn led to Luther by way of Beale, usually is the linking figure there. So this is a long history, actually, going back to the 17th century, and all these currents of basically. We call it the dromedary version, right? It's like a camel. On the one side, you're going to this pinnacle, and then you hit it, and then everything's downhill from there. So the idea that everything was going grand until we get to St. Thomas, you see, and then Scotus is just after the dromedary, just at the lump at and then everything goes downhill. This is the idea, and this goes right into neo-scholastic literature of the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. So it's got a long, and I'm afraid to say, checkered history. Right, most recently in this radical orthodoxy, it's come back in yet a different form. It's without foundation. Okay, if to just take the key issues, the voluntarism claim. Yes, Duns Scotus has the will be a power which has in its power the ability to elicit its own act or not. And yes, he does hold that the Beati could, won't, but could fail to will God. They couldn't will anything else, but they could, as it were, refuse to will. He allows that in distinction 2 in all the versions of the sentences. That is not to be considered as an irrational claim. To the contrary, he's extremely clear that an act of will is not blind, and it requires an act of intellect prior to it. And it's the case that for him, as for St. Thomas for that matter, anything presented as good can in principle be willed by the will. So both the understanding of an object and the judgment that it's good in some sense are precede the act of the will. So it's not an irrational, which is the usual claim. It goes as an irrational theory of will. The claim that God's will is sovereign is, of course, universal to all Orthodox Christian theologians. Yes, Scotus and others talk about how God could have willed the world to be very different. I notice I said could have willed, not that any day now will. Okay, so the distinction is between his ordered will and the absolute power. In other words, if we set aside what he actually willed, God could have willed anything that involved a contradiction. Now that definition of power is from St. Thomas Aquinas, De Potentia Dei, Quaestiones Disputatae. It's a classic definition. So why would you want to object to it? I don't know. The only thing added is that we could look at things counterfactually, thinking about how God could have willed a different universe. He could have willed a universe, for example, in which people were saved, but not by the incarnation. In principle, that could have happened. So that's all we're talking about. It's nothing more than that. So that gets rid of the voluntarism charge. Now, on the knowledge charge, that's even more incredible, because if there's one person who very carefully lays out the foundations for realism, it's Duns Scotus. I mean, this is extremely clear. If you go to the common texts in St. Thomas and Duns Scotus just puts more precise questions to those same doctrines. So the doctrine of nature as somehow common is both in Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus, but only in Duns Scotus is this articulated so you understand what the precise ontological status of the nature is. I wouldn't say he's a more extreme realist than Thomas Aquinas in one sense. That is, it's just more precise about what the nature is as opposed to the individuating principle. It's much more precise than St. Thomas, even though they're both drawing on Avicenna for the doctrine of the common nature. But the idea that somehow Scotus's treatment of those issues should then generate a nominalism, this is seemingly absurd, right? And a person who knew that this is not what it meant to be generated, it wasn't meant to be generated, and who was fully aware of the relevant historical and systematic facts is none other than William of Ockham. And the text I could point you to is once Ockham gets to the relevant point in the sentences, where he's asking about precisely the ontological status of a universal, Scotus had said, famously in his Ordinatio and his Lectura, that if you don't say what I say about the nature, namely that there really is a nature common to many individuals, co-specific or co-generic, prior to the first act of the intellect, then it will, since everything outside the soul is equally numerically one because equally individual, then no two individuals will be, properly speaking, more alike than any other two individuals. And as he says, then it will be true that Socrates is no more like Plato than Socrates is like a line. And if you don't say this, you're going to say that the universal is only a product of the mind. Latin for that is fictitium. And who says at that very point in the sentences, and I say that the universal is nothing but a fictitium, is none other than William of Ockham. Now it's very clear, isn't it, that he means to oppose, not to be in any way harmony. He doesn't see his own thought in harmony, on these points at least, with that of Duns Scotus. Then the man that they're saying Scotus leads to. I mean, the man who tells you that couldn't be true is Ockham himself. So I think this is an eminently clear. This is, I find, the more astonishing point. I mean, that people would think that Scotus is behind modern nominalism. I just find is either they don't know anything about Scotus or they don't know anything about nominalism. I don't know where to begin with these people. I just don't. I have very little sympathy because they don't know. They literally don't know what they're talking about, and you don't know what to make of them. But I mean, I know it's a commonplace view. It's just that there's no historical foundation for that at all once you know the relevant material. I suspect this is largely based in ignorance. I mean, there might be some degree of malevolence, but I don't really blame malevolence. I blame mainly ignorance. But it's an ignorance that nonetheless is blameworthy in the sense that you could know better fairly easily. I mean, the texts I referred to, for example, are available in Alan Walder's translations. I mean, it's not like it's really, really hard to get material. So, yeah, that was what I'd say about that.